Blood satellite.
Yeah, and so that's sort of what I'm trying to accomplish there. Anyway, we got to move on to the next thing. There's actually a couple things I want to do. One is the book, but I actually wanted to look at this article that I read, this Substack, published by Jacques. I've been reading a lot of Jacques lately, and I've got the next Real Secret Coffee Hours that we publish is going to be covering a couple of those articles. But I found this one that I found pretty interesting. The title is Learn to Frame Your Political Goals as Inevitabilities, and the subtitle is Move Past the Black Pill. And there's a lot of good stuff in Jacques. Some stuff I disagree with, but I think they're on the right track most of the time. And I think I'm just going to start reading it here, and let me know if this resonates with you at all. He says it's written by, just published by Jacques. I don't think it has an author listed here, does it? Doesn't look like it. Anyway, just published by Jacques. Says a tactic of successful left-wing social campaigners in recent history has been to present their ideological end goal as an inevitability. A tactic of successful left-wing social campaigners in recent history has been to present their ideological end goal as an inevitability. Understanding how this tactic works is key to understanding why the right in Britain is so useless at fighting its own battles. The LGBT lobby was able to push forward homosexual marriage because its opponents accepted that there was an underlying force of social liberalization which politics could only respond to as opposed to direct. Within the Brit popper mind, the term modern refers to diversity, homosexuality, and climate activism. You are more or less modern based on how much you accept these premises. So that was an interesting way to frame these social changes as these are modern, these are the future, and you must always define yourself on how much you want to live in the future. I do think that is correct. That's something we don't tend to do on the right. We actually work in the opposite direction. We say our things are from time immemorial or they're grounded in the past, but that lacks an inevitability. That's more from a position of stasis. And I think if you have a contest between inevitability and stasis, I think inevitability wins, at least on an emotional level in people's minds. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that actually does make sense.
He says, the demoralization of the right crops up constantly during the 20th century. Harold Macmillan, Britain's worst prime minister, would airily declare in 1960 that decolonialization was an inevitable and that resisting it would be futile because of the growing natural political consciousness of the eternally financed African communists agitating for change. Europeans living in Rhodesia took a different view, knowing the reality of what life under black majority rule would be like, and so fought tenaciously against the nationalists and their own international communist backers. For this, the British government under Wilson froze Rhodesia's financial assets held in London and used its position in the UN to enforce crippling oil sanctions on the Nascent Republic. Decolonialization was inevitable, of course, and a sincere and natural political movement in Africa, but it would need some European prodding and intrigue to help it along the way. So you're so convinced about something's inevitability that you're willing to bend the rules. And I think that's an interesting relationship where if you truly believe something is inevitable, you'll do anything together because who are you to prevent something's inevitability in a sense? And again, I hate to keep mentioning that thought experiment Rocco's Basilisk, but there's other versions of it out there. But it's like if you are truly convinced that this future is going to happen, it's just whether or not you're known as helping it occur, your toolkit expands. Like you're willing to bend the rules, you're willing to blur any line to get there because, you know, if it almost seems like justice. It's justice that this is the future. And so why is there any dirty pool in justice, right? Which is something a lot of these lawyers would unironically think. He says there are 2 points to make here. The first is that opinion can be rapidly shaped by confident political movements like the communists, like leftists. I agree that the Conservative Party needs to find a way of appealing to young people. This will not come from promising to build more heckin' houses in Swanley or tentatively increasing the childcare allowance. It will come when a party of the right pitches to Nicholas, 30 years old. There's an appendix here. We will cut immigration so you don't have to finance Karim, and will punish him for committing crimes. We will raid pension funds to pay down the lockdown debt. We will sell off all that social housing in East London and build 6-bedroom houses in the ashes for you and your girlfriend to start a family in. Give us power or grimly accept a lower quality of life than your parents enjoyed. I know you're not a statist by any stretch of the imagination. However, if you were to have a political party, one that accomplishes those things would be ideal. Right? Basically, like, we're going to take everything from these migrants and just build big houses for you to have a big family in. And again, I mentioned this before, but it's like, what COVID-19, the lockdowns, and the stimulus proved was that the government can kind of do whatever the fuck it wants when it wants to. And you see this in the welfare state. But the COVID-19 phenomena was relevant because of how quickly they, with the snap of a finger, they just decided to just give people money and do whatever the fuck they wanted. So the question is, well, why don't they do that for you? They
Right.
can build you a big house to have a big family on a nice plot of land if they fucking wanted to. They just want to build favelas. So a conservative movement could be radical in the sense that they would enact a radical policy for a traditionalist outcome.
Hmm.
That to me is, I've never once heard a conservative say that. But imagine Pierre Polyev saying that, like, I'm going to act like an absolute fucking psycho to make sure you have a house with a chimney. Do you realize how well that would work?
Yeah.
The second point here is that you must never, ever, ever accept pessimism that your political opponents want you to believe in. Your opponents are not high status members of the cathedral wearing turtlenecks sitting in a cafe in New Haven with a MacBook. They are gibbering reactionary alcoholics like Steve Bray who are screaming against the inevitable tide of progress. Human germline engineering, the fall of Frey, net zero immigration, 0% income taxes, the abolishment of EDI, the depopulation of the North. These are pots of gold that aren't just there for the taking. This revolution is the natural and unassailable consequence of the injustices that the social democratic regime has inflicted on Britain. So I think that's a great thing. Like, these aren't things that are just inevitable. They're things that you can stop. What other response could there be to Rotherham to 50% of your income on rent? The spring is coiled, and futile whimpering from old ghouls like Alistair Campbell cannot prevent it from bursting free from the box. I believe this sincerely. Musk's tenure at Twitter has unlocked rapid progress in American politics. Friends of the Substack and their tweets find the tweets plagiarized within days in the opinion pages of the August broadsheets. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I do. This is something that we always bring up. Like, do not fall for the trap of thinking that progress, like, it's written, it's in the code of the word progress. We're always progressing. We're always moving forward. So we have let our enemies hijack the entire concept of moving into the future as something that they define. And we have fallen into that trap by saying that we just own the past. And I think there has to be some kind of model where we have to be moving forward with the past in mind, or recontextualizing the past. But if we can't always be looking backwards, because all we own is stasis rather than inevitability. What do you think about that? It was kind of a short article, but it hit that point that I think was important. What do you think about that?
No, I actually agree. I completely agree. I think it's kind of related, but there's kind of, for me, an idea of accountability when I'm working on a large project or something that I'm not even sure it will work. I think of it in my head as if it's inevitable, or it must happen, or it will happen, or putting it in those terms. It's like you said, it almost like feels like you're accountable towards it, like it's going to happen with or without you, and you want to be a part of it. Or rather, you speak to other people in those terms, and even if you don't necessarily believe it, it makes it real for them. And there can sometimes be a feedback loop where that encourages them to, at the very least, get out of the way to allow it to happen. And yeah, it's definitely, if we're just talking about the benefit of doing it or not doing it, yeah, you should absolutely treat
Yeah,
things as inevitable.
it's easy to tally up the failures, the practical acute failures of leftists in their attempts to enact their policy. But simply by them pursuing it, that does inch that boulder up the hill inch by inch over time. So it's like, yeah, you can say that they didn't get exactly what they wanted, but they've changed the temperature by so many of them repeating it. In that sense, is sort of dialectical. It's like the political environment that we exist in. It's people exerting power, and we live in the tension between those two forces. So it doesn't even matter if they succeed in their campaigns. The fact that they're fighting it is what really matters, and that's what affects the discourse. And that moves the Overton window. There's lots of different ways to summarize this phenomena, but it's the fact that the fight is being fought that changes the relationship of power to those who are advocating for it. Like, these leftists are, like you said, just fucking moronic, drunk pieces of shit. But it turns out just being those things, and also loud and also consistent, is enough to kind of move their policies in that if progress is happening, it's just a certain color they assign to it, and it's a color that we don't want to bother painting with. So it ties into this book that I read recently that I really liked. Is written by this guy named Martin Gurri. And this Martin Gurri guy is a fascinating individual. He wrote this book called Revolt of the Public, which I'm not sure if he wrote that with Revolt of the Elites by Christopher Lasch in mind, but it's almost the counterexample. I think you might find this book very interesting. But Martin Gurri is a former CIA analyst who's always going on about the relationship between politics and media. He writes a lot for Discourse magazine, but he's like from the world of military and civil intelligence, which I think adds a bit of credential to what he wants to say.
But what I would hear from my masters was, so what is people going to do when the secret police comes knocking on the door? Hit them with their laptops. It was a bad joke again, but that's what I heard a lot. I left government in 2010. 2011 was Arab Spring. Arab Spring was absolute confirmation that you could take a revolt from the digital universe to the streets of Cairo and Tahrir Square and overthrow a dictator of 30 years. That revolt was entirely planned on Facebook.
This is similar to the last book we covered, which was The Emancipation of Authorship, which was all about how the fifth wave, the information revolution, completely changed the relationship of individuals to information, and that information as it relates to power. And I think this book takes that a bit further and talks about how populist movements that oftentimes are initiated by online sources and online communities can actually tear down the authority of the central government. And this happens all throughout the world, whether or not they're influenced by dark money funding cover revolutions. The mechanism seems to be the same, and it can in fact happen in America.
Occupy Wall Street, gathered together, occupied several places around America, Security Park. A few months passed by, they dissipated. Whatever happened, and now they're gone. And each one of these revolts begins online. And each one of these groups has the characteristics of an online group. And anybody who's been online knows what that is. It means ferociously egalitarian. Ferociously egalitarian. Nobody stands out, and whoever thinks of standing out a little bit gets immediately, just attacked. Non-programmatic, it means that every one of these groups are against something, usually just the established order, right? And if you were to press them, what are they for? They would disintegrate into hostile, war bands saying, well, I'm for this, I'm for that. I'm a libertarian, I'm an anarchist, I'm a socialist, I'm a conservative. But we all are against some established thing, like the Spanish government with the Indignados, like Mubarak with Tahrir Square, like capitalism for Occupy Wall Street. They're against that. But you ask them, what would you put in its place? And it's not like the individuals don't have answers, but there's no group answer.
And I find this interesting because in our spaces, people scoff at populism. They think populism is stupid. And especially if you're a fan of elite theory, and we have covered elite theory, and I like it quite a bit. But I think it's unignorable how the information revolution has tilted the axis or otherwise reshaped the relationship of central, solidified, ossified power to the rest of the public, which are now able to network in a more dynamic way and attack the authority of the center of power. And they tend, this is how, and we covered this with Empire and Communications and a few other books. Even Marshall McLuhan talks about this, about how we've adapted new communications techniques that the center of power doesn't understand, but it's slowly trying to adopt. But again, it's not all the way there. And as that's happening, we are still attacking the authority in ways that were unthinkable even 50 years ago, of politicians, of institutions, of academia, of everything. Everything is in flux right now. I think we've just gotten used to it because we're young enough to be used to it. But this would be something interesting to ask boomers. Like, do you remember when you were a 20, 30-year-old, how there was zero legitimacy to anything? Isn't that weird? Like there's no legitimacy in the news. There's no legitimacy in the government. Nothing in this entire society. And that's actually replicated across the world, at least in those places where this technology propagates and people embrace it. So what this book is about is that, basically. And there's just some parts I want to read because he says it the best here. He says, as the amount of information available to the public increased, the authoritativeness of any one source decreased. Early in the new millennium, it became apparent to anyone with eyes to see that we had entered the informational order unprecedented in the experience of the human race. Uncertainty is an acid, corrosive to authority. Once the monopoly on information is lost, so too is our trust.
I think the revolt of the public is aimed at the hierarchical structure of modern government as such, in disregard of the political systems involved. I think the public moves online at the speed of light and can't understand why the elites remain so happily ensconced in their immobile pyramids. I also think that in the digital age, the government could clearly be flatter and faster, but also that the elites have absolutely no intention of allowing this to happen.
Importance measured by public attention reflected elite tastes. As newcomers from the digital frontiers began to crowd out the elites, our sense of what is important fractured along the edges of countless niche interests. That passive mass audience on which so many political and economic institutions demanded had itself become unbundled, disaggregated, fragmented into what he calls viral communities, groups of wildly disparate size gathered organically around a shared interest or theme. And this is, that'll sound familiar to anyone who's on the right or in the distant right, but that's replicated everywhere else. People are configuring themselves in new types of groups. And what's interesting is if you contrast this against our coverage of The Square and the Tower by Niall Ferguson, this isn't far and away from how intellectual movements in the past occurred. It's just supercharged. So there's more people, there's more educated and connected people forming more types of groups that the ossified center of power just can't fucking understand. And when they do link up together, they can actually attack power more coherently than any time in the past. He says, it's simply false to say that the public can't make the leap between virtual and real politics. The problem has been posed in terms of online quote-unquote weak bonds against real-life strong bonds. All we need to know about the strong bonds objection in connection with the Egyptian uprising is that it applies only to the old mode of forming a mass movement. If the protesters of the Egyptian uprising and many other Middle Eastern color revolutions, if those protesters had sought to replace the regime with a specific set of people, programs, and principles, the weak bonds of the digital world would have been insufficient. But that's not what brought the varied Egyptian public into the streets. They just wanted to get rid of Mubarak. And that's something that he mentions quite a bit in the book, that if I don't get to it, because we'll run out of time, I wanted to establish now. It's that we often forget that populist revolts, or revolts of any kind, aren't really supposed to actually propose a policy position. You know, when they take down power, people say like, oh, they ripped it down. And so who are they electing to replace it? Well, that's not actually the point. And that's not how you get anyone to do anything. You can almost only coordinate the people to destroy something or to take over the palace or storm the Capitol. And the fact that you don't have a guy, a new Congress to install there, that's not really part of the selling point of a revolt. It's just to like, we just know we want this motherfucker gone or those motherfuckers gone. And what happens after that is a different beast entirely. And even in the Square and the Tower, Niall Ferguson mentioned something interesting. It's like it actually it's surprising how after the communists tore down the power, they were almost ready to go right away on their own momentum to put people into place. But that's not actually how most revolts have happened in the past. Usually they just cut the head off the guy they hate and then they dissipate. So there's another mechanism in these revolts behind the scenes where the people actually planning it have their own plans that they don't tell anyone else. But that's a different thing entirely. So he says, my thesis is a simple one. We are caught between an old world which is decreasingly able to sustain us intellectually and spiritually, maybe even materially, and a new world that has not yet been born. Given the character of the forces of change, we may be stuck for decades in this ungainly posture. You who are young today may not live to see its resolution. Each side in the struggle has a standard bearer, authority for the old industrial scheme that has dominated globally for a century and a half, the public for the uncertain dispensation striving to become manifest. The perturbing agent between authority and public is information. So that's an interesting way to see, like, we're living in an era of transition that maybe we won't even live to see the end of. But this will be us actually exiting the mindset of the Industrial Revolution. And I was thinking just the other day, I was thinking about Marx and how I was thinking that Marx is a great thinker if you keep him bounded within a very specific window of time, because Marx, for all his greatness and his faults, seemed to be one of the best critics of the Industrial Revolution as a social phenomenon and the investigation of this concept of surplus that sort of replicates itself, which you wouldn't even think of in a feudal society or a more traditional society. So if you actually just look at Marx as a critique of a specific type of capitalism with a very specific type of production model, I'm like, well, it's pretty good. Not a lot of other people were even looking at it that way. But that mode of production was what we call the Industrial Revolution, and our conceptualization of automation upon automation upon automation to serve mankind. Well, we've actually broken away from that because we've learned that automation doesn't really seem to serve us. And I think that's something you comment on now. Like, we have so many algorithms and so much software as a service, and has that made our lives better, or has it made us worse? Has the Industrial Revolution made us worse in terms of mental acuity, in terms of physical health, in terms of, you know, our ability to sustain a family? It seems to have actually made things quite a bit worse. So we're kind of breaking from the mythology of the Industrial Revolution as just this fucking mechanism that will blow gold all over the place. But we don't know what the next thing is. We don't have the next model that's better than that. So it's just this fucking spitting, coffin smoking 19th century idea that's trying to survive in the 21st century, and nothing fucking works, and nothing's legitimate, and everyone's pissed off and killing themselves and killing each other. So and maybe our kids resolve that, but maybe it's their kids, you know.
We're kind of like a mirror that has fallen, and the public lives on the broken shards, and each shard has a perspective on reality. I'm not a postmodernist, okay?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm standing in the middle of a street and I see a truck coming at me, I can't postmodern my way out of being run over, all right? I'm going to just jump and get out of the way. But most of what we deal with in our society today, most of the facts, most of the reality, most of the truth that we deal with in our society are mediated. They're given to us by someone, starting with your teachers and then all the way out with authorities that you trust, the media, and so forth. And I think that is what's also fractured. And so post-truth is the idea that in certain quarters, people still believe that Donald Trump was colluding with the Russians, and that's been pretty much refuted, with deep investigations. The QAnon people that stormed the Capitol building believe that our government was run by a pedophile ring, right? So, I mean, these are so. The dangerous side of that is that at some point we disintegrate into the Tower of Babel. We're all speaking different languages and we're kind of yelling at each other.
He describes it here in a way that we've described it in the past, but just so people are clear on the terms, he says the center and border can be applied to organizations embracing specific structures, ideals, and beliefs about the future. The two archetypes are relative to each other and perform a kind of dance which determines the direction of social action. The center envisions a future to be the continuation of the status quo and churns out program after program to protect its vision. The border, in contrast, is composed of sects, and we would say networks, which are voluntary associations of equals. Sects exist to oppose the center. They stand firmly against it. They have, however, no intention of governing, and this is what I was talking about before, and develop no capacity for exercising power. Rank means inequality. Hierarchy means conspiracy to the border. Rather than articulate programs as alternatives to the center, the sects aim to model the behaviors demanded from the godly or good society. Sound familiar to the type of people we see in this space? We actually don't even want to use the language or the mechanisms of the state. We hate the system so much that we want to propose something that's almost the polar opposite of it. And that's what we talk about so much on this side of things. But we're trying to envision an alternative to like the secular humanist liberal democracy. That's just a different thing entirely, rather than just try and tweak this to make it better. He says the fracturing of the public along niche interests has unleashed swarms of networks against every sacred precinct of authority. Failure has been criticized, mocked, and magnified. The result is paralysis by distrust. The border, it is already clear, can neutralize but not replace the center. Networks can protest and overthrow, but never govern. Bureaucratic inertia confronts digital nihilism. The sum is zero. I like that part. That put into words something we've been developing over the past couple months. But it's interesting hearing someone, a former CIA analyst, analyst. I'm trying to say analyst. And,
anal assistant.
A CIA anal assistant is what I was trying to say. I like this part too. He says, the closest historical parallel to our time may have been the wars of religion of the 17th century. I say this not necessarily because of the chaos and bloodshed of the period, but because every principle was contested. If an educated person of that era were transported to the present, the first question would be, who won, Catholics or Protestants? For us, the question has no meaning. Both sides endured. Neither really won. Something different evolved from that conflict. Much the same, I suspect, will occur with the dispute of hierarchy and network. And that's the part that stuck with me. I think if anything sticks with the listeners, it should be that. And this is why I said sort of dialectical at the start, which is, these two opposing forces conflicting against each other and the tension created between them. That tension is almost like our reality. So the fact that these two opposing forces are opposing each other, period, means that we live in the reality of whatever those two sides are. So, and there will be that synthesis. Like when we think of winning and losing, we think one, the Catholics and the Protestants, one was victorious over the other. Well, no, we actually have 21st century America, where the versions of Catholicism and Protestantism that we have now within America would perhaps literally blow the minds of the 17th century people out of the back of their skulls. And that's how you need to conceptualize the future, as strange syntheses of these forces. And these forces, these forces impacting the future, not specifically by the specifics of their schemes, but something that reminds you of them, but they didn't get exactly what they wanted, but they persisted in a new evolved form. So just like the very presence of communist agitation will perpetuate the existence of communism in the future. Even if they don't get their certain policies enacted, there will be communist policies kind of working their way in some form in the future, unless you remove communists entirely. In that sense, the very presence of these people, the very free speech of these people, perpetuates their existence going forward. There is no marketplace of ideas. There is no zero-sum game where one idea loses once it's proven wrong, once it's been disputed. Yeah, have you ever noticed that communist governments failed all through the 20th century? Yeah, we still have communists. So that should just let you know that there's no authority to tell which idea is better or worse.
Interestingly, there's places where the communists won, like Vietnam, and 50 years later, they're really only nominally communist, or China, right? Like, can you really? Let's be honest. Is China a communist country? I mean, it's an authoritarian country.
It's weird that they believe they're communist. They believe they're communist more than they are. Like, it's a weird thing they're doing.
And that's the same kind of thing. It's like capitalism versus communism. It's like we don't really have capitalism or communism anymore. Not in the way that we did during the Cold War. We have all of this weird globalist, state capitalist, it's all shades of brown. It's awful, but I mean, it is interesting to say that, that old war is kind of, it's a ghost now. I don't know. It's weird.
Both sides lost according to their own terms.
Yes.
Yet both survived and became melted to each other. Like two enemies fusing into some fucking sick chimera.
Like Godzilla and King Kong.
You
right?
You could have let it go. I think the end of because they're friends and enemies, but they all unite against Mecha Godzilla. And in fact, it is Godzilla and King Kong and friends. Because I forgot to mention this, they brought Mothra back.
Oh, nice.
And when asked how that happened, the movie did not have an answer because Mothra died in the first Godzilla vs. Kong, and then through tribal magic, Mothra came back in the film and did nothing, by the way.
Was that actually through tribal magic? Is that the explanation?
Yes, because the tribe worshipped Mothra, and they did some chanting, and Mothra came back. And again, brought back to do nothing, just to be on screen. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen, maybe in the history of film. So he says here, at this stage, the public, clustered around network communities of interest, has effectively taken control of the means of communication. Vital communities revolve around favorite themes and channels, which in the aggregate reveal the true tastes of the public, as opposed to what the mass media corporations or governments wish the public to be interested in. The public, and this is what I found most interesting, because he even ties this to, if you remember when we talked about the transformation of the public sphere by was it Jürgen Habermas, I believe, about the emergence of the bourgeoisie as this like educated class representing the public. Like they were known as the public, and the rest of the people weren't actually known as the public at the time. Just the sort of generated representatives of the public, like the mouthpieces of the public. But he says here, the public can never be the people because the people are an abstraction of political philosophy. The people, strictly speaking, don't exist. Thinkers like Locke and Jefferson, who affirmed the sovereignty of the people, were preoccupied with protecting the freedom of action of the individual citizen against the crushing embrace of the state. The famous "We the People" of the preamble of the Constitution was a rejection by the framers of the ultimate authority of the state governments, but the people themselves were eternally present. Were eternally absent, rather.
Walter Lippmann, he said the public is not a fixed body. The public is any group of individuals who are interested in an affair and are pursuing it as either actors or by influencing other actors. So in the contemporary setting, there is no such thing as a public. There are many publics. It just sounds silly if you say publics in plural, so I always say it in singular. But when I say it, think of it more as a mosaic, as a fragment upon fragment. That's one side of the fight.
The ordinary person, so hopelessly parochial through all of history, got flattened into the masses, better educated, more affluent and mobile, and organized into gigantic hierarchies for every domain of activity. The masses functioned as the anti-public. More precisely, the masses impersonated the public for the benefit of the hierarchy while stripping it of all spontaneity and repudiating its authentic interests. In the marketplace, for example, the mass consumer was created by stripping away all peculiarities and recognizing only certain universal needs and tastes, those satisfied by mass production. Intoxicated by the successes of industrial organization, the founders of mass movements and their admirers and imitators sought to reduce political action to pure mechanics. This was true right and left, and regardless of any actual content of the movement's ideology. And I love that explanation of like, what do we mean by the masses? What do we mean by the public? You have the public as a representation of the masses. Then you have the masses as being defined by society as like what is like the materialistic individual in a sense, as a unit of politics. And then mass movements, basically the entire idea of a mass movement emerged from the Industrial Revolution, that we can use in these individuals as cogs in this political machine, right? And that's, you know, maybe that's ending too, because do we young people, millennials, Gen X, are we still enticed by mass movements? Not really. I think January 6th was such a great example of this. Like, if you want to just like zoom in on that movement, it was a collection of different groups. Like, you had the America First group, then you had the InfoWars group, and those are actually different. And then you had like QAnon types, and these guys don't get along, but they kind of just converged in this one sort of area. But it wasn't a mass movement. It kind of became its own thing. But the idea of like having like Jimmy Hoffa represent like the biggest union in America and being able to wield that as if he's some kind of monarch, that doesn't fucking exist anymore. Even like the teachers and cops unions don't operate like that. They're just almost like a mafia at that point. And a mafia isn't really a top-down organization. It's just clusters of psychos stealing, and occasionally someone has to step in when it gets slightly too violent. But other than that, you know, mafias are pretty chaotic if you look at them. He says here, the relationship between the public and the crowd is not transparent. Though closely associated with one another, the two are never identical. The public, we know, is composed of private persons welded together by a shared point of reference, what Walter Lippmann called an interest in an affair. Members of the public tend to be dispersed, typically influence events from a distance only, by means of soft persuasion. A crowd, on the contrary, is always manifest and capable of great physical destructiveness and ferocity. It is a form of action which submerges the desires of many individuals into a single rough-hewn will. Like a riot, for example. In direct democracies, like ancient Athens, it could be said to represent the will of the sovereign people. Everywhere else, the crowd can represent nothing but itself. The mass movement buried alive the public and deprived the crowd of all spontaneous life and independence of purpose. Everything was scripted, and the scripts appeared insincere almost by design, a tendency that attained a pathological intensity in North Korea, where the masses were made to perform acrobatic tricks usually reserved for the circus. It says authority, as I use the term, flows from legitimacy, derived from monopoly. To some intermediate degree, the public must trust and heed authority, or it has no authority at all. An important social function of authority is to deliver certainty in an uncertain world. It explains reality in the context of the shared story of the group. For this, it must rely on persuasion rather than compulsion, since naked force is a destroyer of trust and faith. Authority being an intangible quality, those who wield it wish to be recognized for what they are. Current structures of authority and a legacy of the industrial age, the public, when it needs answers, turns to institutions rather than charismatic individuals. He said, if I were a doctor attempting to diagnose this particular sickness, which is the crisis of authority, I will look for definite causal patterns and symptoms. Among the patterns, I would include exaggerated expectations by the public, abetted by exaggerated claims of competence by authority. A second causal pattern would be the elite's loss of control over the story told about their performance, particularly when it failed to meet expectations. Such control, I noted, is a function of monopoly. So another way to diagnose the pattern is to determine whether the public has broken the institution's grip on information and communication. For example, climatologists conspiring to silence dissident views must believe that their data is a professional secret and their private emails are inviolable, while the public must be able to see the emperor for all his nakedness. And he actually goes into this in the book, like one of the biggest leaks that damaged the climate science guys, the scientists, was like once the leaks of their emails showing that how much they hated the public and how much they thought the public was stupid, and even though their data was wrong and fucked up, they're like, these people don't even have a right to view this. Who are they to question us, even though we don't know what we're saying? And then so that was like a crisis of authority. Like, no, we tell you what the climate is, and that's why like climate science has never recovered. It's never recovered. Like if you look around, like that's one thing people should take into account. Like 0 people take climate science seriously. All you've got is the state wielding this hammer trying to like push through legislation. But go ask people on the street what their opinion of global warming is. No one really takes it seriously anymore, I don't think. Like it's mocked routinely in articles and everything. And so that is a great example of the crisis of legitimacy. He says here, and this kind of cycles back to what we were talking about before, authority has always fostered an illusion of inevitability. For obvious reasons, if an expiration date were stamped on the federal government, defection from its mandates would begin today. To the extent that the public doubts the permanence of institutions, the authority of the latter will be subverted. There's a belief that digital is forever, that naked photos of your youth will haunt you to the grave. In fact, the opposite is closer to the truth. Digital means ephemeral. Online authority, influence, and attention fluctuate rapidly. Websites go up, have a brief moment on the speaker's platform, then turn mute. The words and images sometimes persist fossilized, but just as often disappear. You would expect the loss of a stable existence on Earth to drive a search for fixicity on a higher sphere. If this is the case, a rise in the appeal of fundamentalism will testify to the experience of impermanence. I thought that was an interesting thing that, you know, we do think that things that are said online will follow you forever. It's actually the opposite. It's the most in flux and impermanent place you can imagine, which is evidenced by people's inability to find old media. Like media is constantly slipping through our fingers. It's very hard to locate anything unless it's, you know, being perpetuated purposefully. He's got a part here near the end of the book that I found really interesting. He says, drill down into the networks that have enabled the public to confound authority, and you soon arrive at what I would call the personal sphere. This is the circle of everyday life, experienced directly in all of its local specificity. Here, the choices meaningful to an individual get generated: spouse, children, friends, career, faith. Government and high politics fill in the background. Because the personal sphere is tightly clustered, information seldom strays from more than 1 or 2 causal links away from action. A friend mentions a job opening in his company. You apply for the position. Government in the 12th century looked into the personal sphere, found it ineligible for its purposes, and thought to impose on it symmetry and uniformity. In democracies, the impulse to standardize usually led to some version of Brasilia, the geometric city without sidewalks or neighborhoods. The public had options and everywhere had cashed them in to pull the elites down to the lower height of the political pyramid. Ordinary people have turned the tables on the standardizing bureaucracies and now insist that their tastes and interests be imposed on the larger system. And that really is the heart of this book. It is the force projected from these new communities that have formed on the borders, which more and more people populate, and they're granted more tools from which to affect the authority of the state. And they've been attacking the authority for decades now, which is why nothing in our society right now has any authority. And I think that's actually evidence that we are winning. If you if you look at what the actual war is, and if you look at this thing called the dissident right, really we're just attacking, and we've been attacking, and we've been pretty good at attacking. I think our greatest victories have been us attacking the authority of institutions, and over time, moving the Overton window, or red pilling people, or disrupting the status quo, however you want to describe it. We're pretty good at that, and often we're hard on ourselves. It's like, well, what do we want to replace it with? Well, maybe most of us don't need to. Maybe for a lot of us, attacking that authority is enough, because it shouldn't be the responsibility of everyone participating to have a full schematic for what happens after the authority is completely disrupted. The people who want to plan for that are probably already planning for that. But for most people, like the person who just hate that the government hates them, and they look and they see politicians advocating against their interest, it actually is enough for you just want to get them the fuck out, to clear them out, as Bowden would say, you know? And for most people, that's enough. For the rest of us, we will come up, not us specifically, but those who are thinking about this will try and come up with some type of plan. But the purpose, I think, for the dissident right, and maybe a lot of the fringe right now, is just keep attacking the authority. That's all you need to do right now. Maybe that's all you should want to do, because that's hard enough as it is. It's actually pretty fucking hard to break down all the pillars of this system that have become hijacked and aligned against you, because you can actually attack those and collapse those without collapsing the entire society and living in the ruins and inheriting the ashes, which is what some people think about. Like, they actually need everything to be flattened. I don't think so. I just think you need to probably attack the institutions and the legitimacy of the power. And I think that anything that replaces that is probably going to be done by our children. I think that's a good window of time to keep in mind. And don't put too much pressure on yourself that you don't have the answer right now. I think it's a multi-generational project to not just fix society. It's not just fixing the government or trying to medicate or reorient the state. That's not really what we're doing here. We are, in fact, trying to find new grounding as this system is failing. This is what it feels like when the system is collapsing. There is no legitimacy. We are already finding new tribes and finding new networks. This is just what that process feels like emotionally, psychologically. And, you know, the fact that you feel this way doesn't mean you're broken or you're doing it wrong. But I think, you know, if you conceptualize it as a multi-generation project, and maybe just attacking authority is enough for solutions to emerge and then we can deal with those, I think that's more the game that we're playing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's also a better way of organizing people. Like, I mean, I think we talked before about the War of the Flea and some of these concepts in counterinsurgency, and they realize that sometimes you're fighting an enemy force that is like an organized army, but sometimes you're just fighting quote unquote villagers, like in Vietnam or in Iraq. But like, from our perspective, the people that we're talking to day to day who are animated by the problems that we're having, we're not animated. Not everybody is animated by theory cell shit about how things ought to be or possible future systems. We're just pissed. The taxes are too fucking high, man. Rent is too high. Like, I'm just mad. We just kind of want to break stuff, and that's okay. And when I say that's okay, I mean, like, wars have been won recently over with that as the primary force behind it, is just people who are fucking mad because there aren't enough cucumbers. Like, that's not weird or abnormal. You should not, you know, that's fine.
Yeah, there's people, you don't have a house, you want a house, and there's forces at work to try and dissuade you from wanting a house, and you're allowed to just want to get rid of those people.
Yes.
And believing in the inevitability that if these people are not here, the natural baseline default is that we can have a house. the reason we can't have a house right now is there's a vast system, a financial system that is, not to get into the nitty gritty, but it's basically, it's a financial system creating a liquidity crisis in the interest of affording baby boomers a glide path in retirement to keep their asset values high by collateralizing all fucking asset classes, basically using inflation to keep their assets always increasing at the expense of everyone else in society. That actually is a system by design that you can disrupt. It's not the inevitability of economics that houses are completely fucking unaffordable. It turns out if you just cut the heads off of a few motherfuckers, I think things rebalance and we can actually start, because like if you want to go and build your own house, you fucking can't. If you want to do anything yourself, you actually can't, because there's certain people who actually just don't want you to do it yourself. And if we're allowed to do things ourselves, I'm not trying to make an anarchist position. I'm just trying to say, like, even groups of people could like get a village together if there were not laws specifically prohibiting that, just because they don't like people having that much sovereignty.
That relates to food and to healthcare. This is the COVID thing, and to housing and to all of it. Your ability to be competent and do things for yourself is bad for them because it pulls you out of the market. The last thing that they want is you doing anything that could be considered cheap or thrifty. They want every hour of your day and they want every dollar in your pocket. So, and when I say they, I just mean the guy who you should throw a rock at. That guy. It doesn't matter who it does. Could be anybody. Could be your dad. It could be a banker. It could be a Jew. It could be the mayor. Doesn't matter. It could be could be those evil capitalists. I don't fucking care who it is, dude.
And we'll just end on this. I want to read this because I know we gotta get going. We've been going over time here, but I just want to say, He says, the great strategic reversal that we've experienced has produced few alternatives to the ideas and ideologies that dominated the industrial age. The public rides on new technologies and platforms, but as users rather than makers. It is uninterested in leveraging technical innovation to formulate its own ideology, programs, or plans. The public opposes, but does not propose. So, in the second decade of the new millennium, political arguments resemble a distorted echo of the French Revolution or Victorian England. We still quarrel in terms of left and right, conservative and liberal, even while the old landscape has been swept clean and the relevance of these venerable labels has become uncertain. The lack of new alternatives of a way out has trapped democratic politics in a perpetual feedback loop of failure and negation. And negation invoked from every corner without relief has driven the democratic process to the edge of nihilism, the belief that the status quo is so abhorrent that destruction will be a form of progress. And I think that's a good way to end it.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.